Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending the talk, by the way. I'm pretty excited to be here. I'm going to talk about lightning and lightning risks. And the one thing that I would like, by the way, is for this talk to be informational. There is a lot of things unknown about lightning and lightning risks, particularly in spaceports, launch pads, vehicles. And we're going to touch about some of those aspects there. I have put a couple of publications in the tables on the back. It's a 3-part paper that we published in the SIPDA last year, and has to do with lessons learned from the space program from the early stages from Apollo. And I don't know if you guys know these, but although we perhaps credit, and rightfully so, Benjamin Franklin for modern lightning protection system, it wasn't until NASA started having problems at the launch pads with the Apollo program that their true lightning modern protection systems took off. And I'm going to go a little bit over that as well. So along the lines, this should be an informational talk. I want to say that the lightning exposure is measurable. Okay, that the consequences are engineerable and that the risks can be mitigated. And that is our responsibility, just to mitigate the risks. So the line protection should be treated as a mission system rather than a compliance checkbox. Because if we try to do that, then we continue to have exposure to lightning. Now, I will say that in 2022, and I'm going to try to make this long story very, very brief, I was involved with the protection or the design of the line protection system for 39B, which is the picture that you see on the right-hand side there. And we started designing the system in 2007. And finally, when Artemis 1 made it to the pad in 2022, we had already been instrumented the line protection system at 39B for many years, and we were monitoring lightning discharges and so on and so forth. And the day after the vehicle made it to the pad for the wet rehearsal, we observed the very first and strongest positive lightning strike to the line protection system. And of course, there were bells all over the place that sounded because not only this was an extremely high energy event, but it was the first time that we had observed one direct positive strike to the pad in over 11 years of operation. But I will also mention that because of the instrumentation that was put in place, there were no concerns about the health of the vehicle shortly after the lightning strike. Things that would have taken us days and days back in the shuttle days. So with the proper instrumentation, of course, there is a lot of conclusions that you can draw, educated conclusions, so you can move on without those additional risks. Now, what I hope that I can convey is the 4 lightning damage pathways that exist. Also, that there are many different types of architectures that you can use, right? But they have to be driven by lightning risk assessments. You have to make sure that you understand the risks and you can address them properly. And this, by the way, doesn't go just for the assets on the ground or the spaceport, it goes for the vehicle as well, and payloads. I want to be very careful with when I say this. There is no standard that we can use right now and say, this is the standard that I should use to design the line protection system on my launch pad. Okay, the best probably that we can use is NFPA 780, which is the line protection standard for the US, but we have to tailor that standard because we cannot just apply it as is. That's one of the challenges that we have. And you gotta understand the standard and then understand the intent so you can properly apply the standard and tailor it consequently. So I'm going to use then at the end a 5-question resilient test guide to see if I've made myself clear. Hopefully I have. So how is it that vehicles or payloads can be exposed to lightning risks? So there is a few of them, right? The first one that we have is the direct lightning strike. We have a vehicle at a launch pad, we don't have a lightning protection system. That vehicle is exposed to a direct lightning strike, and that can have severe or even catastrophic consequences, okay? I am not aware of a vehicle that has been built or designed, built, and validated to withstand lightning strikes. Besides, when the vehicle is at a launch pad, there's a lot of interfaces connected to it. Mainly of them can be fuel or commodities, right? That you don't want any charges flowing through. So we gotta be careful with that. The second threat, or the second type, will be a nearby strike. Now, what happens with a lightning strike is a source of electromagnetic interference. It creates very large electromagnetic fields. So if we have a lightning protection system, in this case, the tower on the right-hand side, right? And that tower gets struck by lightning, it's going to generate large electromagnetic fields that can affect the vehicle or even ground systems as well. So that's the second type of damage, nearby strikes and the induced transients. Now, the first, so the third event will be the direct strike to connected services. So I have a tank with fuel or with oxygen or whatever I may have, but that is connected back to the launch pad. That storage gets struck by lightning. Now I can have direct lightning current injection into my launch pad vehicle or systems that are trying to support the launch environment. And the fourth will be, of course, a nearby strike to the service. Similar to the nearby strike to the vehicle, that nearby strike to the services is also going to induce currents and voltages that can propagate and damage flight hardware, ground support equipment, and so on and so forth. Now, besides that part, we have another risk, and that is if we launch a vehicle into an electrified atmosphere, we run the risk of triggering lightning. That is, the vehicle can initiate a lightning discharge that would not have happened if we hadn't launched the vehicle. And I'm gonna make a brief parenthesis to tell you, I was at a place called the International Center for Lightning Research and Testing, managed and operated by the University of Florida, where I did my PhD. And what we used to do was to launch fiberglass rockets with a spool of wire underneath. And under the proper atmospheric conditions, about 6 out of 10 times, we will trigger lightning. We will initiate lightning artificially, right? We wanted to do that, because we wanted to test equipment, and we managed to burn a lot of equipment that way, but that's how we learned, right? In this particular case, we don't want these rockets to trigger lightning. Why? Because there can be consequences. I will also say that there is several cases, documented cases of vehicles triggering lightning. Apollo 12 was probably one of the first examples. And then we had the Atlas Centaur. There is also a Soyuz a vehicle that suffered a direct lightning strike on ascent. So anyways, there is also a lot of non-documented cases where vehicles have been lost, and it is believed to be caused because of lightning strike. But without any type of documentation, without any type of instrumentation, it is very, very difficult to determine if the loss was caused, in fact, by a triggered lightning or not. So the early pads, the Apollo era, used the launch umbilical tower as the main protection, right? In that case, you don't have separate towers. You don't have a system trying to keep lightning away from the vehicle. When lightning struck the tower, that current will be shared by the vehicle. And there were certain damages and problems with the early days with this particular approach. Now, what happens when the launch umbilical tower gets struck by lightning, currents will flow through interfaces, circuits, and it will probably couple into your vehicle, causing damage. There's one thing that we have to be very careful here, and that is there is something that we call immediate damage, right? Lightning strikes and immediately something stops working. Well, we're aware of that problem, and luckily we can replace it without much of a problem. There is also something called latent damages, right? So what lightning does in these high electromagnetic fields, they can shorten the life expectancy of electrical and electronic components. There's something called the bathtub curve on reliability engineering. When we shorten that bathtub curve, now the damage is imminent. It can change hours, days, or weeks after the event. And without any type of health and status, it makes it very, very difficult for us to realize that that is happening. So after that design, in the 1975 or so, NASA decided to go with the first isolated lightning protection system. That meant they will put an insulating mast on top of the tower, right, that was servicing the vehicle, and we have Cat9 wires represented by those white lines getting the lightning current away from the vehicle. Those were the very early stages of the more advanced lightning protection system. Now, what happens with modern electronics nowadays, of course, is that we have smaller electronics that work with smaller voltages. They are faster, but they're also a lot more susceptible to electromagnetic interference, which is something like lightning causes. Now, the architecture, and this is something that we will find in many different places, can be different. But this should be driven by a lightning risk assessment, right? So what is the density of lightning expected in your area? I can tell you here at the Kennedy Space Center, Cape Canaveral Space Force Station, we have a lot of lightning activity. There's something called the Lightning Alley that goes from Tampa almost all the way down to Daytona. And it's a strip in Florida that has tremendous amount of lightning activity. Florida by itself, the lightning capital of the world, yes. So Florida by itself is a state that has the highest lightning activity in the US, but the whole southeast area of the country is very prone to lightning strikes. This particular region here is very prone. And I remember many years ago, I went to a conference and I had a chance to talk to the shuttle director, to the program director, and he said, Carlos, you know, many years after we decided to do what we do, I still ask myself, why is it that we chose this area to launch these vehicles? Because there is so much lightning. So we cannot take that for granted, right? We know we're going to get lightning, but we know how to protect against it, and we better do. Now, there are some other launch pads where lightning may not be that frequent. So you probably don't need a lightning protection system with Cat9 wires and insulating towers and so on and so forth. In the case of Wallops on the right-hand side, they use towers, right? There is no insulating mast. There is no Cat9 wires. The lightning activity there is a little less. Now, the difference in between the system on the left and the system on the right is huge. On the left, when you have a lightning strike to the Cat9 wire system, those currents will be diverted away from the vehicle. The electromagnetic exposure of the vehicle on the payload is very, very small. On the other hand, on the system on the right-hand side, those fault towers that you see there, if they get struck by lightning, that lightning current is going to flow straight down those poles, and the electromagnetic environment will be much, much larger than in the case of the left. So where you can manage the risk procedurally, and by that I mean if your launch window is large, if you are not in a rush to launch, right? If you can take your time, you can wait for the perfect weather to launch the vehicle. Now, in some cases, we probably don't have that luxury. The time window may be short. And not only that, multi-spaceports are going to probably require one customer to move quickly because there is another one waiting, right? So delays in one launch can have consequences on the cadence coming up. So something to keep in mind. And that is why I say that the lightning protection system should be done by a lightning risk assessment. What are the risks? We got to identify the risks, right? What is the probability of the risk causing damage? And what is the consequence of the damage? If you have a vehicle that is lost because you trigger lightning on ascent, it's very unlikely to cause damage to the infrastructure that the next customer is going to want to use to launch their vehicle. But if your vehicle has a problem at the launch pad, that can also have consequences to the next customer. So something to keep in mind. So for vertical launches, the standard is very clear. The insulating masts with the line protection system towers and the Cat9 wires is by far the golden. And there is, by the way, proof of that. Launch Complex 39B, 39A, 40, 41, they use the same architecture, and they are repeatedly struck by lightning with vehicles at the pad with no consequences, right? You may have damage to ground support equipment here and there, but not to the vehicle. Now, the damage to the ground support equipment is also manageable, by the way, but it's not what you look for when you're trying to protect vehicles and fly hardware. Remember, risk-based, that is the key. Now, mission assurance is also something that we have to be very, very careful with. Back in the early days, when NASA and the Apollo program were working, they used magnetic tapes to try to measure how strong incident lightning currents were. I mean, I'm pushing back the memory of probably most of you. That was many, many years ago. Well, that technology has changed tremendously. Nowadays, we can actually have instrumentation connected directly to the avionics. And we don't have to try to infer what a nearby lightning strike can cause in our systems. And that is something that I strongly support. We worked for many, many years back in, 2008, 2009 timeframe on all the instrumentation that we put on the mobile launcher that has connection to the buses that feed the vehicle. And we can see in real time, as a matter of fact, any deviations on voltages or currents from those buses that feed the vehicle. And that is important because it gives us that level of assurance. In the case of the 140 kiloamp positive strike that I showed you earlier to the pad, we knew that those voltages and currents had not exceeded design requirements. And that allows us to say, we feel good about what happened, and we feel good about the way that the line protection system performed. Now, let's talk, I already mentioned this earlier, and I want to be very careful here, okay? NFPA 780 is a great standard and what we have to use as our main guideline. But just the same way that it doesn't address power generation plants, it doesn't address launch pads either. Okay, it doesn't say within the scope, when you have a launch pad, this is what you have to do. But it does have all the articles that we need to implement. Some of them need to be tailored. Okay, there is no way that we can implement some of the things that NFPA 780 says and still manage to make money if we're going to launch vehicles. Because we can. It will be some things that are very, very expensive. For instance, if we were to follow the Sci-Flash equations that NFPA gives us, the dimensions of the insulating mass will be humongous. And that will be extremely expensive. Those insulating masks, as they are extremely expensive already. Trying to follow the guideline by the standard, it will be much, much more. So there is transient analysis that we can do to mitigate those risks. And when we do that, we can shorten the dimension of these insulators tremendously, making sure that we invest the right amount of money and we don't invest a lot more than we should. So the challenge here becomes now with the EMI sensitivity of either the vehicle or the payload, because most of the times that is unknown. And if you ask a space launch provider or even a customer, they will tell you, we don't know what our sensitivity is. And this is not the EMI that you test in an EMI chamber. Okay, the EMI chamber, you're typically looking at hundreds of megahertz, gigahertz interference, whether you upset the electronics or not. Lightning will cause a tremendous amount of energy to be released in a very short period of time on much lower frequencies than that. And by that, I mean tens of kilohertz to hundreds of kilohertz. So even though you have done your due diligence and tested the payload on the vehicle to EMI exposure and susceptibility, you still have not addressed the lightning risk. And that is something that not a lot of people are aware of. So be careful with that part. Now, there is a military document, AFMAN 91710, that says for launch pads with launch vehicles and a spacecraft sensitive to worst-case electromagnetic field strengths that can be generated by a direct lightning strike on one of the lightning protection system support towers, the launch pad catenary lightning protection system towers shall serve only as catenary wire supports and shall not be used as lightning down conductors. What that means is that we don't want currents flowing down on the tower themselves. We want those currents to be carried to ground away from the launch pad, so they do not generate large fields. But my question is simple. So who determines, right, what is sensitive to worst case electromagnetic interference? Because it's not clear. If you told me, the fields cannot exceed 100 ampere meters, then we have a hard requirement that we got to meet, but that is not explained. So it seems like it's left up to the provider or the user to determine if their assets are sensitive or not. And unfortunately, you can find that out the hard way. There is a concept that comes up pretty often, and I am asked this question pretty often too. And it says, well, Carlos, how about eliminating lightning? Because there are companies that sell products to eliminate lightning. And I could probably try to point you to many different publications, articles, and peer-reviewed publications that say that these devices probably don't do what vendors claim that they do. But the best way that I could try to explain or maybe give an analogy and explain why these devices don't work is someone on the shore of the Kennedy Space Center putting a sign to stop the tide when we have a hurricane. There are some things that humans we wish that we would do, but we just cannot do. The technology is not there, and it's very unlikely to be there, by the way. Now, I will go a little beyond maybe what I should go, and I will say that there is cloud seeding experiments that have shown promising results, where you can try to prevent electrification of the clouds. But this is on a much, much smaller scale, right? There is very little you can do against a big thunderstorm. Humans we don't have the power to challenge Mother Nature now. So let's just be very careful with how we buy these technologies and how we use them, because the consequences, again, can be bad. So these are the 5 questions for the lightning resilience test. What is our measured lightning environment and exposure window? Can we quantify that? Which damage pathways are explicitly addressed? Are we protecting the vehicle against direct lightning strikes? Are we protecting them against nearby lightning strikes? Are we protecting our ground support equipment against direct lightning strikes? How do we verify bonding and grounding integrity, and how often should we do that? What is our retest criteria? How often should we inspect our systems? What is the interface protection strategy for power, comm, umbilicals on the vehicle? And after a strike, what evidence supports go, no go? If we can answer all those 5 questions, then I think that we have properly addressed the situation there.